Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to everyone in the room. I'm delighted to say we've had to roll some additional chairs in. Something wrong with your ears, or do I need to speak up a bit? I'll speak up a bit. And welcome to those who are joining on Zoom. My name is Tom Miller, and I'm a member of the faculty here. And on behalf of Karen Svitchelmore, our interim director, I want to welcome you all to the second of our Spring Science for Community seminar series. In this series of 5 presentations, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary as a research institution based here in Solomons. Last week, we had a presentation about the history of the institution. Tonight, I'll introduce our speaker in a minute or two who will talk about some aspects of the history of Solomons. And for the next 3 talks after that, we're going to talk about the history of some of the science that has been done here, talking about why what we do is important and the contributions we've made to understanding both the state and the nation. So, by way of introduction, we were founded in 1925 by a remarkable gentleman called Reginald Truitt, who set us on our current path. He had a vision for how research should be done. He was devilishly good looking. He was a great dancer. He was a world expert in crabs and was the founding director of CBL, a position I held until a few years ago. My wife sitting over there says the only thing I have in common with him is that I was also director of the Chesapeake. It really is a heritage to be proud of, and we certainly are very, very excited to be celebrating it. We are part of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, which is comprised of 6 groups strategically located, we like to say, more honestly, serendipitously located around the state, that allow us to cover things that are of interest to the state of Maryland and her citizens, from genes to ecosystems and from mountains to the sea. We are unique in that our mandate is to conduct what is termed a predictive ecology to better understand the environment. We interpret that to mean we will conduct research on any aspect that affects you, the citizens of Maryland, informs people who make decisions on our behalf at the state level, at the regional level, and at the national level. That recognition is what is driving this series of celebrations around the state. We are launching 100 stories about our past, and you can find much more about our heritage and our actions over this centenary year at that website, umcs100.org. So as I said, this is 5 presentations as part of our Science for Community seminar series. Last week, our president, Don Bosch, talked about Truitt. Tonight, as I said, we're going to talk about Solomons. And then the 3 remaining talks on the next 3 Tuesdays cover our history of water quality monitoring. I then talk about Truitt's vision for science, and my colleague Dave Secor will talk about another remarkable character in our history, a fisheries ecologist who died tragically young called Romeo Mansuetti. And please, you're welcome to all of them. We videotape them. We post them on our website. So if you miss one and want to see one of these or one of the others that we've been doing over the last decade, all of those are available online. Just to highlight 2 significant changes. Last week, one of our faculty members was given the University System of Maryland Board of Regents Award for Excellence in Scholarship. considering there are something like 17,000 faculty at the University System of Maryland, the fact that one of the 25 of us from here gets an award at that level, I think speaks to the standard of research that our faculty conduct. And we're also really excited to welcome on the 1st of August, our new director, Dr. Beth Polidoro. Beth will be joining us from Arizona State University. She is an internationally recognized toxicologist who also does work globally on biodiversity and protection of species. She will join us on August the 1st, and as I said, we are all terribly excited about the directions in which she will take us. That heritage is one we're very proud of. We're also exceptionally proud of our future. You'll see part of that future as you leave the building. Look to your left, there's a brand new building going up, part of a $22 million investment by the state of Maryland to establish the Chesapeake Analytics Collaborative Building, which will invite the community in to work with us to address and potentially solve the environmental challenges that we face. As always, we are welcoming of anyone who wishes to help us with our mission. One of our 100 stories is to try and gather 100 donors over the course of these seminars, and you'll see that last week we made a good start on that goal. All right, with that, it is my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Ralph Eshelman. Ralph holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. He said that's not something very special. I didn't think he meant the Michigan part. I think he meant the PhD part, which is typical of how humble a person Ralph is. Ralph was the founding director of the Calvert Marine Museum. He was its first employee in 1974 and set the course of that institution until he retired in 1990 and was succeeded by Doug Owls, who's sitting in the back corner. And I often say when I talk about my own journey here, that when my wife and I came to visit to determine whether we wanted to move to Solomons, because we had an idea of a small college town, and this is very much a small college. It was the quality of the Marine Museum that convinced us to come. It is really a remarkably exceptional institution that owes a lot to Ralph's vision and Doug's vision, and we're very lucky to have scholars of such repute leading our institution. And so with no more introduction, I want to hand the microphone over to Ralph, who's going to talk about the history of Solomons.
Well, thank you, Tom. Can everybody hear okay?
I don't think it's on.
It was a very generous introduction. Thank you.
It is on.
Sounds like
Just
the volume
it's turned down. I'll see if I can turn it up.
At any rate, Tom made an interesting comment about the Marine Museum influencing him to come to Solomons. And I have kind of a similar story because when I first came to Solomons, the first group of people that I really got to know were the folks here at CBL. You know, I had been in academia for so many years, and I came to Southern Maryland, and there wasn't a whole lot of academia activity except right here on the island. And I just kind of migrated down here, and I was welcomed into the fold, almost like I was part of the faculty. So it's really a synergism, I guess you could say, between the two institutions, which I very much enjoyed. I could go on to stories, but we'll never get done with what we want to do here tonight. But just one of them is, I don't know how many of you know that we used to play volleyball here religiously. I mean, it was serious stuff. And I would quit whatever I was doing to make sure that I was here to be able to play volleyball with all of the other folks from the lab. And that's really how I got to meet so many of them. And they're wonderful people. So I congratulate all of them for their 100th anniversary. What an achievement. Well done. All right, our job tonight is to talk about the Calvert Marine Museum and the laboratory and all of the other things that make this island unique and special. And I don't know how many people have thought about it, but this laboratory played a significant role in making a lot of that happen. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Reginald Truitt, the first director, was also at one time the president of the Calvert County Historical Society. He was the founding director of the Calvert County Historical Society, which sponsored the Calvert Marine Museum. And the first building for the Calvert Marine Museum was located on the island. And Bill Dovell, who was one of the research scientists here, was one of the principal persons who gathered up a lot of the folks in this area to build that first temporary building. So this is just an example of how this laboratory, to me, has had an important influence on what has happened here on Solomon's Island. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the history. I'm very informal. If you have comments, feel free to shout out if you've got some information or you don't agree with something I want to say, and we'll see how this all goes. So Solomon's Island, a historical perspective. It's not easy to find an early map that shows Solomon's Island. And this is the best one that I've ever seen. And this dates from the War of 1812. And what you're looking at is a map that was done by Commodore Joshua Barney. And his job was a flotilla called the Chesapeake Flotilla to try to protect the average citizen in the Chesapeake Bay from the depredations of the British. And poor Barney gets blockaded into the Patuxent River. And so he made this map of the mouth of the Patuxent River. And what you can see right here is Somerville Island. That's what it was called in 1814. This is not a particularly accurate map of what Solomon's Island looks like, but it does show something that's very interesting. See that building right there? You notice the location of that building? That's the Solomon's House. Who owns the Solomon's House today? The Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. Who has preserved that house? The Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. It's the visitor center for this institution. If you haven't been there, you need to go. You need to go see it. I could talk for an hour just about what happened here in the War of 1812, but we don't have time to do that. So instead, I'm going to go 10 years later. This is a Coast and Geodetic Survey map that shows Solomon's Island. At that time, it was referred to as Sandy Island. I think you can make out the name right there. And you notice the shape of it? Some people refer to it as the tobacco pipe. It kind of reminds you of that, doesn't it? Holbert Footner, if you're familiar with him, he's written over 180 books. Many of them talk about this area that we're in right now. A profuse writer. And he used to live in one of the historic homes, and he used to come down here all the time, and he always referred it to the tobacco pipe because of the shape. The reason I'm showing it to you, this is a detail of that same map. This will work. Uh-oh, did we just freeze up?
Did I?
Not sure what happened. For some reason, it seems to have frozen.
That was me, I'm sorry.
Let's see if we can go backwards. No, it's frozen.
now.
There we go. Who knows? So this is a detail of it. And again, you can see that same house. But 10 years later, you can also see a second house. So that's the Solomon's House. And there's a second house right there. A couple of other things you might notice is that all of the stippling represents very shallow water.
So that's a tiki bar?
if you're gonna build a house, you probably want it to be near deep water. And both of those houses are. Because how did you get to the island? You're coming by boat. That's Solomon's house. So the next time you go down to the island, to the tip, take a look at it. The original house probably was this portion right here. And we think because of the architecture and some of the details inside of that house, it probably dates from the 1780s. That's a pretty good old house. And it's been added on to over the years. Eventually, they had to build a bridge, because if you're going to develop an island, you want to have better access than just having to come down by boat. And so they built this bridge. And the bridge was built in 1895. This is a photograph of it in 1909. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if we could still go across the bridge like that to get to the island? This is another photograph. I'm standing on the bridge looking at the island. And you're looking at the Solomon's Methodist Church. So when you come onto the island, or when you leave more appropriately this evening, think about how that has all changed. So the beginning of the island was at the church. It's not where the Lower Oyster House is today. All of that has been filled in. It's all new land. They also built a causeway. This is a photograph of it in 1915. And if you look over to the left, you can see the bridge is still standing. Now they built a concrete wall, and they're going to begin to fill behind that wall. And then when they get enough fill in there so that you can then drive across the causeway, they're going to take down the bridge. So another big change for Solomon's Island. And this is what it looked like after the causeway had been completed. You're looking at a schooner that is offloading very large stone, probably came from Port Deposit. That's the nearest place on the Chesapeake Bay where you could get large stone to come down and use for something like this, because we're in the coastal plain. We don't have hard rock here. So you had to get to the Piedmont. And the closest place in the Chesapeake where you could get to the Piedmont by boat is essentially Port Deposit up by Havre de Grace. So that's where this stone was coming back. And you can see that now the bridge has been removed. And now this is the causeway to the island. There used to be a windmill. And this is a photograph that was taken from the top of the windmill that shows you the Methodist Church, the completion of the causeway, and you can also make out, whoops, I hit the wrong button. This will probably happen many times. Right there is the tide box. I think all of you know that when you come on to quote unquote the island, you go over the tide box, which makes it, you truly are still an island. That's the tide box right there. Here's another photograph. But now you notice that you have oyster houses on stilts along the causeway. Where did all of the oyster shell go? Into the water. That's the area that is land today when you come on to quote unquote the island. The Lower Oyster House is immediately beyond the tide box. So here's a detail of that. And I just wanted to point out something that I think probably very few of you ever realized. In the front yard of the Methodist Church is this grave of a Civil War veteran. Just out of curiosity, how many people here knew there was a Civil War veteran buried on Solomon's Island? And you probably walked by that many, many times, or you've driven by it in a car, but we never took the time to look at the gravestone that was there, even though it's marked with a Civil War veteran who is buried right there. This is one of the oyster houses. This is the Woodburn Oyster House. Do you guys remember when Woodburn's was a grocery store? No. The same family. They started in the oyster industry. You see all the shell there. That's the beginning of the buildup of the land around the causeway. Down below, this is the J.C. Lohr Oyster House. Look at all of the oyster shell back there. The same thing is going on. It's repeating itself every oyster season over and over and over. There's the tide box. Ask a typical tourist where the island begins, and they'll have no idea because they don't even realize they're going over the tide box. This is a photograph looking back on that causeway. Isn't it interesting how different it is today from what it was back then? This is probably the biggest change that happened on the island. And this is when Isaac Solomons, who gave his name to what we call this island today, decided to come down from Baltimore and establish an oyster cannery. Now think about that. Why would he do that? He did it because the best oysters were coming from around the Patuxent River. That meant that the best oysters were being shipped all the way up to Baltimore, where the oyster canneries were located. So he came up with the idea, I'm going to go buy this island, Somerville Island. I'm going to turn it into a cannery so that all of the oyster boats aren't going to have to go all the way to Baltimore to sell their catch. But in order to open up the cannery, guess what he had to bring from Baltimore? He had to bring the cans. Seriously, there was no cannery here. So instead of the oysters going to Baltimore, the cans are coming here to be canned. If you look closely at this, this is interesting to me. You all know during the Civil War, many, many photographs were taken of the battles that took place. We do not have a single photograph of what that cannery looked like. They're got to be out there somewhere. I'll bet some of you must have them hidden in a closet in your home or whatever. But we don't have any of these photographs of what it looked like. The best idea that we have is based on someone's drawing. And we know this drawing is relatively accurate, but it also exaggerates some things. Like, for example, if you look at the Solomons house is bigger in retrospect to its actual size. But we do know that the cannery was a very elongate building, and we know that there were other buildings that were attached to it in a cross-like pattern. And this is based on oral descriptions of the cannery that have been passed down over time. The other thing that's interesting about it is that if you look closely, all of these right here are buildings that were built by Isaac Solomons to house the workers at the cannery. Of all of those buildings that were built, only one of them remains today that was built for the lodging of the employees. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute. And who owns it? The Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. And who has preserved it? The Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. Where would we be without the laboratory? The other thing I wanted to point out to you is these are lime kilns. The shell that was left over was ground up and made into lime and sold as a byproduct. And you're looking at several piers. This is the pier where the oysters were brought in and where the oysters were canned and shipped out. This is the pier where the lime was shipped out. And this is a ship repair yard. Isaac Solomons knew that in order to get the watermen to come and sell their oysters, they needed to have a repair yard locally to maintain their vessels. This man was a good businessman. Everything he knew that needed to be done to make this viable, he did it. These are some of the duplexes that survived, that we have photographs for. I know I'm kind of standing in
No,
the
you're
way.
not, am I?
If you look carefully in this upper image, you see the differences in the roof? That's a duplex that originally was just one living quarter. It had been doubled. If you look to the one to the right of it, that's a duplex that had been expanded into a triplex. That tells you that the oyster plant was doing well. They needed more lodging for the people who were working here. Down below are a couple of details of what the typical duplexes would have looked like. Above are tokens. If you worked for the cannery, you didn't get paid in cash. You got paid in tokens. And it's an interesting concept because number one, you didn't have to live in the housing that was provided by the company, but there weren't a whole lot of options. But if you chose to live in that housing, that was deducted from your salary before you ever got paid. Then you got paid in tokens that could only be used in the company store. So when you went to buy food or clothing or whatever, you went to the company store because the other stores wouldn't necessarily accept the tokens. Why would they? It's not real money. Interesting, isn't it? This is not an unusual situation. If you think of the woolen mills that existed on the Patuxent River at the same time and even earlier, they operated in exactly the same way. The woolen mills at Savage, the woolen mills in Laurel, Maryland, all operated the same way. This is the duplex I was telling you about that is the sole survivor. And it's right on Farron Avenue. And it's really not very far from where we are right now. This, folks, is probably the most unique artifact that's owned by the Calvert Marine Museum. You can argue that. But the reason I say it is you're looking at a label off of an oyster can that was found in a gold mine in California. And if you read the label very carefully, hopefully you can make out there's Solomon's, Maryland, right there, Solomon's Island, Maryland. That's where those oysters were packed. And then they were sent to California and they were recanned by this company over here on the left in San Francisco. This can was found in that gold mine because apparently a miner had taken in these cans of oysters, ate the oysters, and then threw the can in a corner somewhere. And it survived in that mine until someone else eventually found it. And over time, it eventually made its way back to Solomon's and is now in the collections of the Calvert Marine Museum. Now, that is one heck of a story. Now, the question is, this is the can with the label. It was found in the gold mine. The question is how did that can get to California? And there's three possible ways. It could have gone by rail across the continent. It could have come by way of the Isthmus of Panama, because there was a railroad that went through the isthmus, so you could ship from one point to the other point, or it could have come around Cape Horn. Which way do you think it came? We don't know for sure, to be honest with you, but it's more than likely that it came across the Transcontinental Railroad, which was built in 1869, and the can was packed in 1875, 6 years after the railroad had opened up. That's a logical conclusion, but we don't know for sure. But think of the story behind that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, were the oysters pasteurized or how were they kept?
They would have been canned. That's correct.
Okay.
And that's another reason why it makes sense for it to have been gone by train.
Yeah.
Because you're really only talking about a matter of at most a week. Whereas if you went by ship, it would have been a lot longer than that. This is a plan of Solomon's Island that dates from 1893. It's very interesting. If you look closely at it, how many of you knew that there was a lake on the island? There was. And that lake was there up until the 1930s. How many of you knew that they were asking for a road to be built along this edge of the island to be called English Avenue? It never got built. The other thing that's interesting about it is Farron Avenue right here, which is the front of the island, which is just over there. And when you stand on Farron Island at Farron Avenue, you're looking out at the mouth of the Patuxent River. But over here, you have Patuxent Avenue, which is on the Patuxent River side overlooking St. Mary's County. Those two roads still have the same name. Many of these other roads that you see in here have been completely changed. Some of the older photographs, when it shows the edge of the water of the island, almost every single one that you look at is going to show you evidence of some type of erosion control. Here you're looking at old wooden bulkheads that have been built. And other instances, you'll see where they brought in riprap and stuff like that. This has been a constant problem for people that live on the island. This is Patuxent Avenue again. Notice all of the wooden, white painted fences. How many of those do you see today? Off to the left, that's the embankment. And that's what that embankment looks like. This is a historical photograph. This is in the 19 teens. So this has a double bulkhead. You're looking at an upper bulkhead here, and you're looking at a lower bulkhead there. This is the causeway. Here you have a cement wall. And behind each of these is where the road was located. The reason you may not recognize it today is that all of that has been expanded significantly, and that's where the parking areas are to accommodate all of the visitors. Do you recognize this? This was later referred to as Bevan Hall, but this was the first building that was built as part of the laboratory. And you might be able to just make out that it appears the building was just about complete, but it had not been moved into yet. The windows are still kind of open. There's no indication of anything inside. This is 1932. What happened in 1933? The famous storm of 33. Hurricanes were not named at this time. This is the hurricane of 33. And then what you're looking at here are the same four windows that you see there. And this is the porch of this house right there. So when I talk about issues of erosion, this is a pretty strong example of it from one storm. The storm of 1933, which by the way, completely destroyed the steamboat wharf on the island. So back to the plan. Let's talk a little bit about that lake. What the heck is going on there? This is a detail of it. And you might be able to make out that the lake actually fed into Back Creek. You can see it right there.
Yeah.
This is a photograph of it before the road was built. This is a detail of it. And what you're looking at is the footbridge for people to be able to walk across so they wouldn't get their feet wet. If you had a wagon or if you're riding a horse, all you had to do was go right along the shore here where it was shallow enough that you personally wouldn't get wet. But who cares if the horse gets wet? And who cares if the wheels of your wagon got wet? But in order to develop the island, you don't want to have to do that. You want to eventually have an honest to goodness road there. So they built a road, and this is the plan for that road. And this is it right here. They're continuing the footbridge, and this is referred to as the shell road. The road was built out of oyster shell. This is Webster's store, no longer here. Some of you probably may remember or have heard about Webster's store. What you're looking at here is the bridge abutment for the oyster shell road that was built so you didn't have to either go across the footbridge or get your feet wet to get from one part of the road to the other part of the road. This is after the Wreckers Hotel was built right next to Woodburns. And again, you can see the embankment, the abutment for the bridge. This is what that area looks like. I'm not going to make any comment as to whether one is better than the other. It's just very different. It's all been filled in. So when you go to the tiki bar, if you park your car back into there, that used to be the lake. Mall's Lake Island. I don't know what people have different names for it. Interesting story behind it. What you're looking at is a net drying reel. These are where hull seines would have been used to catch fish. And those fish would have then been sold to the fish plant, which was located on the opposite side of the island on Back Creek, to make fertilizer. Can you imagine the smell on the island from the fish plant? This is an aerial photograph. This is the earliest known aerial of Solomon's Island. This is 1921. A couple of things I want to point out to you. There's the lake. There's the ball diamond. I think many of you probably might remember Pepper Langley. Pepper Langley used to love to play baseball right there on that diamond. And one of the teams that they particularly liked to beat as often as possible was the team from Millstone Landing over in St. Mary's County. And in order for them to get here to play baseball, they came by boat and vice versa. That's what it was like back in those days. The other thing I want to point out to you is there's the causeway. It hasn't been developed the way we think of it today. And down along, you can see what is today the biological laboratory.
Can you go back to that side?
That's Mole Lake Island right there.
Can you go back one?
I'm sorry?
Can you go back one?
Oh, yeah.
So is that the church, the Catholic church up top?
Yes. Right there.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is Mole Lake Island, and you can see it's not that big of an island, but it was a nuisance. Why? Because it's shallow water. And you might be able to make out there's a couple of buoys and day markers out there to try to help people from running into the island. But it became such a nuisance that eventually they came up with an idea to get rid of it. This is an aerial showing the detail. Here's CBL again, right here with their pier. This is 1937 at the top, 1939 at the bottom. So the idea was we're going to build a bulkhead and we're going to take all the spoils of those shallows areas and we're going to pump them inside the bulkhead. And for those of you that might have already noticed, right up here is the building of the Governor Thomas Johnson Memorial Bridge. So you know what year we're talking about. That bridge opened in December of 1977. So we're talking about 1976. And what you see here is the completion of the bulkhead. And you might actually be able to make out that that's one of the pump hoses that was used to pump out all of the spoils from all of those shallow areas all the way around that bulkhead, so that now it is navigable completely around that island. And this is what all that island looks like today. How many of you knew that there was a movement by some people to move the Drum Point Lighthouse onto Maulet Island? It was a controversial deal, and in the end, they decided it was not a good idea because difficulty of getting people there and maintaining the lighthouse. So that's why it ended up where the Calvert Marine Museum is today. So this is another aerial showing you Ball Leg Island. Now you can see there's vegetation on top. But the main reason I'm showing you this aerial is I want you to look at the shoreline, and everywhere you see on the shoreline is riprap, right? Because of erosion concerns. It's especially prominent right here, and especially prominent right here. The other thing I want you to notice, here's the pier restaurant. This is that area where all of the parking has been added and filled in to accommodate visitors that come to the island today. How many of you knew that there was a marine hospital on Solomon's Island? Why? Because Isaac Solomons was bringing in so many watermen who were oystering that they needed medical assistance. So the US government decided to build a hospital to accommodate the watermen, shuckers, the people that were working in the industry on Solomon's Island. And the building that you're looking at there is one of the original buildings of the oyster cannery. And the US government leased it to open up a marine hospital. Over time, that marine hospital moved to 4 different locations. One of those locations was on a property that was bought by the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. And CBL restored that building and moved it to a different position. So they have now preserved one of the 4 buildings that at one time was the Marine Hospital located on Solomon's Island.
What year was this, Ralph?
This photograph right there is about 1890, 1891. This is that same map I was showing you before. You probably can't see it from where you're located, but that says slaughterhouse, and that says hospital, and that's Charles Street, and that's Williams Street right there. So that's where the first hospital was located, not where the second, not where the third, not where the fourth. But guess what? It's even more interesting than that once I get through some statistics. Between 1891 and 1930, on average, over 200 seamen were treated at the Marine Hospital. So that shows you there was indeed a need for a Marine Hospital here. 11 of those men who were being treated died while they were under the care of the U.S. Marine Hospital Service. The largest number that were ever treated was in 1892, 610 different cases. And you might ask yourself, why so many? Back in those days, you were using hand winders to bring in the dredges, and that's dangerous. You could slip off the boat, one of those dredges, maybe the key doesn't stop, and it starts unwinding, that wheel's going around, it could run into your leg, it could run into your arm, you could break a limb. There's just so many different ways you could get hurt. Imagine working in the cannery. How many people would get harmed working in the cannery? Of the people that died, if there were no kin that were known of, where did they go? Where were they buried? they were buried on Null Lake Island. And that island completely eroded away. So their skeletons, whatever was left of them, got scattered out of the bottom of that creek. What you're looking at here is an ironclad. It dates from the American Civil War. The reason I'm showing it to you is that it was moored in Solomon's Harbor and served as the first marine hospital. And we have the same problem. I cannot find a photograph of it when it was here. Somebody had to take a photograph because it's unusual. Something like that being in the harbor, you know people were taking pictures. We don't have a photograph of it. If you find a photograph, you get a special prize. Why Patuxent oysters? Are they any better than Chincoteague oysters? Some people would say today, yes, they are. I'm going to show you a bunch of ads. This advertisement right there is 1862. This is from the Evening Star. This is a Washington newspaper, 1862. And this is the Overland Oyster Express Company that would guarantee you fresh oysters would be delivered to your door within 36 hours. So within 36 hours in 1962, oysters from the Patuxent River could be delivered to someplace in Washington, D.C. That's pretty interesting. Here's another example. This is the New England restaurant. This is an advertisement in the Washington Times. This is 1919. And if you read on here, Chesapeake, Crisfield, and Patuxent River select prawn oysters. Here's another one. Oyster supper, Solomon's Island oysters. Methodist Church, Washington Street between King and Prince. Anybody want to guess where that is?
Alexandria.
Yes, sir. You get an extra dessert. Alexandria, Virginia is advertising Solomon's Island oysters. And this is in 1919. You'd think they'd want to get some Potomac River oysters. We're going for Patuxent oysters. Here's another one. Oyster prices drop. This is the Washington Evening Star, 1921. And I've highlighted the area. Patuxent River oysters, which are considered to be the best. Lesser grade oysters sold for less money. Isaac Solomons knew what he was doing. He was a good promoter. Whether the Patuxent oyster was really better than any of the other, he made people believe in it. The Collier Inn. This is a restaurant, Washington, D.C. We are now serving our famous Patuxent River oysters. Right there. I threw this one in because I find it interesting. We've talked a little bit about Whitman's already. This is one of their cans. And look at how they spell Patuxent. Did you guys notice that? I got an extra T in there. I just found that really very interesting. But they're advertising Patuxent River saltwater brand oysters. Between 1867 and 1984, there were at least 31 different oyster packing canneries on the Patuxent River. Think about that. That's nearly as many that used to be in Baltimore that are now operating on the Patuxent River, and most of them are going to be between Benedict and Solomon's Island. And of all of those places, Solomon's Island had more oyster canneries than any other site in the entire river. This is the first Lower Oyster House. Now, you guys remember where this was located, the causeway. What you're looking down at the bottom is an oyster knife. This is out of a personal collection. Carter Gray, I don't know if any of you know Carter Gray, an amazing collector. But if you look closely at this oyster knife, you can see IV. And that was the individual shucker's number. So all of these oyster knives had their own number because the shucker didn't want to use someone else's shucking knife. They wanted to use only their shucking knife. And how did they get paid? They usually got paid by the gallon. So the more you shucked, the more money you were going to make. You weren't paid by the hour. This is an advertisement of the J.C. Lore Company. This is 1941. What you're looking at on the right, this is 1931. The hurricane of 33 destroyed that oyster plant. This is the new plant that they built after the hurricane of 33. And you can see it's bigger and better than the one that was there before. And this was from a program from the Yacht Club in 1941. The Yacht Club would sponsor boat races and whatnot. And a lot of the different companies would advertise in those brochures. That building you see on the left, which still stands right near the tide box, is listed on the National Historic Landmark List, which is the highest level of preservation given by the federal government for historic objects and sites. Many of you have probably heard of National Register. That means that it has local significance or maybe regional significance. When it is listed as a National Historic Landmark, that means that it has national significance. There are only 3 oyster houses in the United States that are listed as National Historic Landmarks. And one of them is our Lower Oyster House because of its significance.
Where are the other two?
Sorry.
Where are the other two?
The other one is at Mystic Seaport. It was moved from its original location. And the third is at the Long Island Maritime Museum. It also had been moved from its original location. So of the 3 that exist as National Historic Landmarks, the Lower Oyster House is the only one in its original location. And it's kind of sad to say, but they typically can only open it to the public at low tide because of the changes in sea level. And it makes you wonder, what is the life of the J.C. Lore Oyster House? I'm no longer the director there. Doug, you're no longer the director there. We don't have to worry about that. That's someone else's issue, but it's a concern. I'm not going to read this to you. I've outlined different places where Lower oysters have been known to be shipped. And I want to ask you, consider all of the states where Lower oysters have gone to. And you tell me another oyster house that you know of that comes anywhere close to the list that you see listed here. And the one that may surprise you the most, is that me? Not sure what happened. The one that surprises me the most is this one right there. Antarctica. Now think about that. Isaac Solomons shipped oysters to California. The Lower Oyster House shipped oysters to Antarctica. Is there another community in the world that can say they've shipped oysters to California and to Antarctica? I don't think so. Now, you might be asking yourself, how did Laura oysters get to Antarctica? And there's two answers. One, the Laura Company sold to Baltimore, where the federal government had a military warehouse where they flash froze food for shipment to other military installations throughout the country. Right across the river from the Laura Oyster House is Patuxent River Air Station. Back when Admiral Byrd was establishing his Antarctic research station in Antarctica, it was planes from Patuxent River Air Station that delivered the men and the supplies for the research station. These are planes that flew, hopping around, and eventually landed by ski on top of the Antarctic ice shelf. And they originated from Patuxent Naval Air Station. Very easy for oysters from the Laura Oyster Company to be on some of those planes that went to Antarctica, particularly for a special celebration, such as maybe Christmas or New Year's or whatever. But I mean, what amazing stories. And it's all part of our history right here that very few people know about. When I start running out of time, Tom, you just give me the hook and I'll stop. These are some photographs of what the island looked like around the turn of the century, and you can see oyster shell everywhere. This is before 1917. This is a beautiful stitching of what Back Creek looked like. This is 1919. It's changed a lot. I just wanted to take a minute and point out to you something that's kind of remarkable to me. Eugene Cronin, first director of this laboratory. How many people knew that from 1959 to 1961, he was the president of the Oyster Growers and Dealers Association of North America? That's kind of stepping outside the shoes of what a typical laboratory director would be doing. But he's not the only one. Some of you probably knew George Abbey. I think, Kent, you probably worked with George.
Know him well.
George also served on the board of the Oyster Growers and Dealers Association of North America. And he worked at the Benedict Lab, which at that time was part of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. And then Rupert Lohr, part of the Lohr family, part of the Lohr Oyster House family, he was the president of the Oyster Institute of North America in 1963. The reason I'm pointing this out to you is that these were local people who were serving at national levels of oyster growers and packers from all over, not just the United States, but North America. That doesn't just happen by chance. That happens because of the significance of what was going on in the Patuxent River. How many people know that Solomon's Island is the bugeye capital of the world? A bigger question is, who cares? What is a bugeye? It's usually the question I get. But a bugeye was an oyster dredge boat, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but this is an example. It had 3 sails, it had 2 masts, it had a centerboard. These were dredge boats. Now, most of the oysters that were being harvested in the heyday of the Patuxent River tended to be bugeyes. So is it any question as to why so many bugeyes might not have been built in Solomon's? Well, there was an individual by the name of Brewington. He was called kind of like the maritime father of maritime history of the Chesapeake Bay. And he did an analysis of all of the bugeyes that were built in the Chesapeake Bay. And where you're located, sitting in this room, you may not be able to read it, but this graph right up on the very top is Solomon's Island. And the numbers of bugeyes that were produced were between 50 and 60. If you look at all of the other towns in the Chesapeake, there's not another town that produced more bugeyes than did Solomon's Island. And remember I mentioned Isaac Solomons, when he built his cannery, also put in a repair yard? And from that, and all of the watermen that were coming here to serve that cannery and all of the other oyster houses that came here, more and more shipyards were developed. So in Solomon's Island, there were 4 different shipyards. Think about that. How many shipyards do you get in Baltimore? We're talking about Solomon's Island. 4 shipyards supporting the production and repair of vessels. I mean, this is amazing stuff. I'm not going to spend any time on this. I'm running out of time. I just wanted to point out to you that the William B. Tennyson was not built in Solomon's, but it operated most of its life in Solomon's as part of the J.C. Lohr Oyster House. And it operated primarily as a buy boat. And what that meant is that it would go out to the oyster beds and buy the oysters from the oystermen, take them back to the oyster house, save the watermen the time to have to stop dredging so they could dredge longer and make more money. The William B. Tennyson, I've got a picture of it right there. Hopefully many of you have taken rides on it, is also a National Historic Landmark. Both of those National Historic Landmarks belong to the Calvert Marine Museum. How many museums do you know of in the United States have 2 National Historic Landmarks? Not many. Mystic Seaport has 5. Do you think about the historic ships that they have? No question. Here's a little tidbit for you. This is not Solomon's Island. Anybody know where this is?
Grand Central Station.
Who said that?
I do.
Excellent.
New
You
York.
get an extra dessert. This is the railroad station in New York City. And the reason I'm showing it to you is that if you ever go there, I highly recommend it. It's just kind of a fun place to go. The ceiling light fixtures have an outline of the William B. Tennyson. Now, how many communities in the Chesapeake Bay can claim that? Solomon's is the only one. And the reason it's on there is because whoever did the research for it went online, and then because the William B. Tennyson is a National Historic Landmark, one of the first things that shows up when you say oyster boat is William B. Tennyson. And that's how they came up with the idea of having this as one of their decorations in the Grand Central Station, New York. Steamboats. I'm looking for that high sign, Tom. All right, he's okay, I'm okay.
Good.
You can't talk about Solomon's without talking about steamboats. This is the Anne Arundel coming into the Solomon's Steamboat Wharf. That across the way is the fish factory. I told you about the Halsing nets. That's where all that fish went to, right there. I wanted to remind you that the early steamboats that came into the Patuxent were not like the steamboats that we think of in our mind. They were really more like vessels. And in fact, you can see this as an auxiliary sail.
Yeah.
This is what the first steamboats were like. And they were coming into the Patuxent River, but they weren't coming into Solomon's because the steamboat wharf did not get established in Solomon's until after Isaac Solomons got the island. So we're talking about just after the Civil War. But look at these amazing photographs. Back then, if the steamboat was coming in and you had a visitor or a friend or a family member, you put on the best clothes you had and you went down to the wharf to welcome them to your community. And here you're looking at folks in their best Sunday dresses. You can see a horse in the back, probably had a cart to either bring merchandise down for the steamboat or to take it home that was being offloaded from the steamboat. Here's some ladies dressed up in their finest. We don't do those kinds of things today. I'm as dressed up as I can possibly be, just like this. I like this photograph because you're looking at several different kinds of people here. This guy obviously worked on a steamboat. He might be the purser. This is probably the captain. You can see these boys back here are in their swimsuits. They've been swimming off the pier. You can see some of the stevedores sitting back here waiting for when they need to come and offload or load whatever might be going back and forth. You can also make out 3 officers from the US Navy. What were they doing in Solomons? They might have been on one of the naval vessels that are anchored off in Drum Point area, and they decided to take some shore leave and go into the big city like Washington, D.C. or to Baltimore, and they take the steamboat. You also might notice that's a pen where they would keep the cattle, because cattle were sold back and forth. If you raised cattle on your farm and you wanted to sell them to the meat market in Baltimore, you sent them live on the hoof, right to Baltimore. Different time, different place. I'm just going to kind of cruise through here. I always go longer than I should. This is an excursion. All of those cars parked out there. This is not a typical steamboat. This is an excursion steamboat. What is meant by that is that you're not going to any definitive place. You're just going to go for a steamboat ride. And they typically would do this on a full moon. So you would go out in the daytime, you'd cruise around the bay, watch the full moon, and then come back and everybody would go home. They're called excursions. Sometimes there would be excursions from people in Baltimore who would do an excursion to Solomon's Island. Or there might be a school group, a church-related school group that's trying to raise money. They would charter a steamboat and then put you out on the bay and raise money for the school or for the church or whatever it might be. Kind of a fun way to do it. You notice the stack of the steamer? Anybody recognize the logo?
Keystone.
That's the Pennsylvania Railroad. A lot of people don't think about it, but many of the steamboat lines were ultimately bought by the railroad lines so that they could complete passage from one place to another, regardless of whether it was by boat or whether it was by rail. So you might take a rail, let's say to Baltimore, and then from Baltimore, you might take the steamboat down to Solomon's, or who knows where it might be. Folks, we could go on and on and on. I think by this time you get the idea that Solomon's is a pretty cool place. There's a lot of history here. Bring me back again and we'll do part 2.